I will let everyone around the table introduce themselves, their channel, and a little bit about themselves if they would like to. And then we will get right into the first question. We will start with Dicely D&D.
Well, hello there, everybody. My name is Denny Dicely. I run the Dicely D&D Twitch and YouTube channel, as well as the Play Dicely YouTube channel and Actual Play. I'm the game master for that one.
Hi, my name is Fred Wheeler, and I run the How to D&D YouTube channel. I talk about RPGs, Dungeons and Dragons, and yes, I am on YouTube and other places. You can find me everywhere.
My name is Nicholas. I go by Rook Zero. I run the Rook Zero YouTube channel. I am a freelance illustrator, and I do everything fantasy and D&D.
Welcome back to the channel. We are going to be talking about sandboxes now. So the next question is, how much sandbox is too much sandbox? Do you ever feel the need to push your players in a particular direction? We're going to start with you, Denny.
Well, my thoughts on this, so like defining sandbox like being like, you drop your players into the setting and you kind of let them go wherever they want with little impediment. I think when we're talking about sandbox, you have to think about scale. And then I'm immediately going to backtrack on and say the scale is kind of irrelevant, whether it's kingdom, country, continent, or world, because as long as you got these things, you can kind of work in any of those scales. The first one of these things being having a few points of interest or hooks. I'd probably say about 3 to 4. And, not having too many points of interest helps rein your players in. They have they can go anywhere they want, but there's these 3 or 4 interesting places, and when the options are limited, but they still have options, it's more easy to kind of feel like you have some semblance of control. The second thing is, providing a valid method of transportation in each of these scales, depending on which one you want to go into, whether it's walking within a kingdom or, train, airship, or ship in continent size, being able to kind of justify how you're going to get around between these points of interest. That's kind of important to consider. And as long as you have at least a little bit of fleshing out, like maybe a sentence or two at each of these points of interest, you can then with that bare minimum, let the players go where they want to go. And once you know where their trajectory is, be like, all right, now let's begin kind of developing this, fleshing it out more. I say this, and yet I very much I have difficulty operating like that. I like to flesh things out immensely. I'm like a big pre-planner. I know the method. I still have to practice it. I think maps also help when you have a sandbox, It's, if you've kind of like what I was saying before, you have these scales, you have these points of interest, and have some special mountain drawn on the map, or some tower, something that just looks cool on the map. The players will go, we got to go there. That's the place. And as soon as you draw it, if you're the drawing kind of person, you'll be like, oh yeah, this is where they're going for sure. Sometimes your players will surprise you and you have to kind of improv, but I don't think there is too much sandbox as long as you're willing to accept the challenge. But these are a couple of tips to kind of make it work. As far as, do I feel the need to push players in a particular direction? Not particularly. After a session, I'll ask my players, where do you think you're going next? What are your goals or objectives? And I can use that information to be more prepared as my dumb gotta prepare for everything brain operates. Or if I do decide there is an important I'm jumping ahead in my notes, my apologies. I try not to plan too far ahead. Hilariously, I'm reading notes. so when you're not planning too far ahead, there's less of a reliance on specific locations. I might prep NPCs, clues, pieces of lore, but I kind of let them live loosely. They can drop in wherever I need them to be, and they're not tied to they have to go to the grand city of the capital of the nation or whatever. I could be like, If it makes sense to be found in a dungeon, then they'll find it in a dungeon. There's a little bit of a finesse with this kind of system, though, because if your players know that this is how you operate, it kind of busts the illusion. So hopefully none of my players are watching this evening. So, yeah, I mean, playing loosey-goosey and having vague ideas is a very good way to operate, and I think in a sandbox situation.
So do you run a more structured campaign style and format?
Like I like to think I run a sandboxy kind of thing. Like, I've made a map, I've let my players go where they want, but I also very well know how to lead my group in the directions I want them to go. But
Without forcing.
I don't. Yeah,
Yeah.
it almost is like one of those. I feel like I know exactly where they're going to go, but they've got the illusion of choice. They've made that decision for themselves, even though I know exactly where they're going to go.
Nice. Excellent. Thank you. All right, let's go the other way around. So let's go back over to Nicholas.
Sure. I think you hit on a lot of like the really key things. The same way I kind of DM, that being like the illusion of choice, I think is really important. Especially like you talked about points of interest. I tend to think more of like events of interest. And so with story hooks, I think that's really important. Like, that's really my DMing style. It's like, I need these 3 things to happen during the course of this section of the campaign. And for me, I'm very fluid with where those things can happen. Like you were saying, finding something in a dungeon, it can be any dungeon. It can be a back alley behind a bar room that, a fight broke out, and they're like, oh, hey, we knocked this guy out. He's got the same clothes of the guys we've been following. Like, that being that kind of that being able to be that fluid and that flexible can really lead to dynamic storytelling. And I hate to say this, but I'm totally fine with railroading my players. Like, I think it's so important to, like, we need to get you guys here to advance the story, but I'm not going to force you to take a path to get there. By the end of the night, you guys are going to be where I need you to be, or at least you're going to have the information that you should have been somewhere. And whether that means, like, we're just running out of town. It's like, okay, you guys run out of town. As you sit down for camp, you see the town explode. Something in the distance is happening, and they're like, oh, no. So, like, I let them know that regardless of whether or not they choose to go a specific direction, the events that I need to have happen for the universe are still going to happen. And I have to be dynamic, though, because it's like, okay, they didn't save these people, they didn't find this information. How does the world still playing out so that I can tell my story, even though the players aren't necessarily following that exact plot line? So I very much am a big fan of events of interest that happen. So it's like, you guys are going to have an encounter where you're going to learn this today, but I'm going to give the freedom to you guys to determine where that happens and how exactly it changes. It's very loose, but I have a few groups of friends that don't mesh well together, play style wise. One of them likes evil campaigns, one of them likes being the grand hero. And so it's like, okay, I need 2 different campaigns. I'm only going to write one story, though. So you guys are both going to be interacting with this world in different directions. And I can basically have them run very similar story arcs where they kind of find the same things at about the same time and interact differently, but without it being beholden to like them interacting with the exact same person or having to do the exact same thing. And it's really fun to do that, because then you can also have people have similar experiences and like, oh, I remember when that train rail came down and the bridge was destroyed. That was you guys? And it's like, yeah, that was us. So that's a lot of fun to have those things kind of interact. And the main thing for that is that makes this work is we do a lot of out of game communication. So after, like you were saying, after a session, we'll be like, so how did that feel? Like, what did you guys think was going to happen there? Because you guys seemed to get like, you had kind of a twist there that you didn't expect, even though I thought it was very obvious. And they being able to communicate like that does help me plan, but it also kind of, I can push them in a direction like, oh, I really thought you guys were going to go save those other adventurers. And like, we should have probably done that. But yeah, it's that kind of in and out of game communication, as well as knowing that I have beats I want to hit, but I don't necessarily need them to be in a straight line, that I think makes the game really dynamic and very fluid. And I'm always ready to have my story just be flipped upside down, because my world is still there and it's going to keep going whether or not the players want to interact with it or not. So that's my philosophy.
That's interesting. I feel like I would love to see your prep notes for a session.
Oh, they're very messy. They're very messy and very like point driven. It's lots of dots.
Well, yeah, that sounds interesting. Is it like bullet points of the events you want to get across, not necessarily locations or
Yeah.
specific NPCs with certain information for the most part?
Yeah,
It's
I do a
like-
lot of my planning in Google Docs. So it is very much just like, this is a tavern I want to hit. If nobody talks about it, I never have to open that file again. Great. But then I just have everything listed out in order of like, here's the things that I'm going to have happen, and let's see where the players cross that path. Yeah, and I tend to not plan enough ahead because I do run into NPCs that I didn't expect, that I have to kind of have a little reservoir of like, okay, these are people they might run into, but I'm usually underplanned than overplanned in the way that I run things.
I'm usually underplanned as well. I'll probably touch on it on my turn. That's fascinating. Fred.
Okay. So how much sandbox is too much sandbox for me? I'm not gonna not for other people. I don't really. Yeah, that's your problem. Somebody else. But for me, I guess whatever I think I can manage. Do you know what I mean? And I have had various levels of what I can manage in my life. I would say when I started out, a sandbox was like, it was too hard, and I actually needed like a track to follow, so one point to another point, because I think my first experience of running Star Wars Saga as a DM, well, oh my gosh, I'd spent 26 pages and a couple of weeks of prep, and things did not go well, and all the stuff that I had prepared in this whole location, and suddenly they decided after they had battled one lot of droids, they were going to steal a ship and leave the planet, and so all of my prep notes were gone. So I think when that happened, I kind of partly learned my lesson. I'm not going to say that I didn't make that same mistake multiple times, because I most certainly did. So I wouldn't even say it's a hard guide for me in terms of sandbox or railroad or even a rule for me. It really depends on a lot. And I mean, I could list them all, but I don't think that's very helpful. I guess it's probably better if I just explain what I do now. If I can prep and I have time to prep, I do prep. I often use very short adventures if I'm going to use a pre-made adventure and I'm not going to make my own. And they're usually like a page or maybe 4 pages long, and they're usually made by Kobold Press and not Wizards of the Coast, because Wizards of the Coast sucks at doing that sort of stuff, in my opinion. If I make my own adventure, it's probably 1 page. It's probably based off Chris Perkins' adventure building note interview that he did many years ago, which is just basically recap or adventure hook or quest or whatever it is, followed by a list of the character names and a bit about them, followed by 5 NPCs, followed by 5 locations, followed by 5 or 6 encounters that may not be combat, they may be other things as well, and how they sort of fit together, it sort of depends. And that's it. It's all on 1 A4 page. That's how I would build it if I prep. But I'm also, because I realized I needed to learn how to improvise, there was these things called plot twist cards that Game Mastery put out for Pathfinder, because I'd played Pathfinder as well as 3.5 and 4E. But I used those to learn how to improvise. So I'd give them to my players, and they could affect the story with that card. It had like a little thing that you could, like a tentacle jumps out. It's like, okay, so somewhere in the adventure, a tentacle's going to shoot out, and they would pick when that would happen. And I could either say yes, or I could say no. If I said no, they get to draw a new card. If I said yes, they would tell me what's going to happen, and then I may modify it a bit. And so I had to learn how to adjust based on what the players were doing. So that's how I taught myself how to deal with that. And then I also use those Rory story cubes to help me sort of deal with making things up on the fly. Like, they've decided to find out what's the titles of the books in the bookshelf that we're looking at. After I say there's a bookshelf and there's books there, and they're like, I didn't write down the names of the books. Oh, darn. So I roll the dice and then I make up the names as I go. Um, so, and I've done that with many different things, and NPCs as well, on the fly. So now I am prone to, if I do my own thing and I don't do any prep and I'm not using anybody else's material, I am prone to getting a piece of paper that's blank and getting a pen and just drawing a few squiggly lines on it as if there's like a few continents, like blobs, and then that's my world and I'm ready to go. So 30 seconds, I'm ready to go. I haven't even given it a name. Usually what I do is I will trick my players into giving it a name that I think will be suitable for it, and then I just write it on once they sort of, it's like, yeah. And that's like, well, what's the name of this world? That's a good question. What name do you think it is? Or I'll throw out a name and I'll pick a name that's really, really bad. And I was like, oh, that's really lame. I wish it was something like this. And they'd give it a name, and that's the name I would write on. So I've used many different tactics for getting them to name the world without doing it myself, and the continents. And usually, people provide you with backstories, and if there's somebody who's provided a backstory and they've given you the name of the village they were living in, that seems to be the starting location for my adventure. So the start in this village just happens to be the name of the village you gave in your backstory. So yes, I am prone to starting with literally nothing and just building everything around at times, but that doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes I'm quite happy to just like, I just don't want to have to try to think about it. I'm too tired. I haven't had time. It would just be so much easier if they get from A to B. And because I'm a very location-based dungeon master rather than event-based in terms of the way I let stories run out, I'll just push them in a direction. Yeah. Avalanche, you've got no other direction to go but down the hill. So I don't have to worry about where they go, So, yeah. Lots of different ways, but I guess my preferred method is if I can get it together, and is just to be as broad as I possibly can and literally just write hardly anything and just let them build it all, and I just use a lot of the feedback they give me and just make it up as I go. But that's hard to do, and I've learned the hard way that games where I've done a lot of prep and I thought were going to be really good have not necessarily been as good as games where I did no prep. I showed up, I've been at work, there was no time to do any prep, and I made it all up on the fly. And then they say something like, the players say the most horrific and appalling thing that they could possibly say after you've done no prep and you were terrified and thought the session was horrible. And they say, man, that was the best session either. And you think, well, what the hell was I doing all that prep in the first place? If you're gonna say that to me, I mean, what the heck? I mean, seriously. So yeah, sandboxes are good, but cool, blimey.
That's awesome. You kind of touched on a lot of stuff for me too. So for me, the big thing I've found when I started playing RPGs as a DM, the first time I really DM'd, it was online. It was through like chat room. It was easy because you have all the time in the world to say what you're going to say. You don't have to react instantly, really. You know what I mean? You get a moment to think before you type it. When I first ran a campaign in person, it was for my sister, her now husband, and my wife. And I hadn't played a ton of games over the years in person. So again, it was a learning experience for me. And I also didn't know the group and their play style. And I actually never even thought at that time about anybody's play style. I was like, this is how you play the game and whatever, because that's how we played it when I've played it before. So I was very green when I started. We were doing a superhero game. And things that were difficult for me to wrap my head around was travel, how to give them hooks when they've got things like television and radio and all these things around them, right? Like it's so much. And it was hard even when I'd give them hooks because of the play style of the players. So I tried to run a completely open sandbox. Like, yeah, what are you doing? You're in a city. It's this time of the afternoon. What would you like to do with your characters? And you're all together, but what are you guys doing? And like they were at a bar, because hey, one of them was used to playing D&D. They're like, you go to a tavern. So we're in a bar. So I was like, all right, TV's on and the news is on. And, oh, a cop drove by, like speeding through the city. And You're like throwing these hooks at them, right? On the TV, the news cuts away to this incident happening at a bank. And they're like, oh, okay. And they're waiting for me to tell them more. And I'm like, what more do I have to say? I don't know what to do. I think I made the bank like basically outside so that like I could have it, you know what I mean? I didn't know how to kick them along. For me, my very first session I DM'd was, I think, too much of a sandbox. I decided before session 2, I would give them an NPC that could tell them. He was also a mechanic, so he worked on their like vehicles and gadgets and stuff like that. And I was like, oh, this person calls you, he tells you got to be here. So the group needed pushes, at least early on. I play with my wife now, and she doesn't need pushes anymore. And she actually had a ton of experience playing D&D, but she always played with older siblings, so she wasn't allowed to be the decision maker, so she wasn't used to that kind of thing. At least that's my theory on it. And then my sister and her husband had never played RPGs before. They had done, I guess, message forum, like role play for like Buffy the Vampire Slayer or something, and some other fanfic. But anyways, I learned, that was my first experience in, I need to know my player's play style to determine how I'm going to do things. I had done a ton of prep. I had way over prepped who the characters were that were robbing the bank. Hell, I had police chief named, and the different police guys that were going to be on the scene named. I had all sorts of things. And it was all this prep, but the other problem I had is I had went to the internet for advice on DMing and watching YouTube channels and things like that back around whatever 2010. The big buzzword was do not railroad your players. And so I was like, oh, you don't want to railroad them because they always feel like they're forced and they have no choice. So I went the complete opposite and, tried to let them do what they wanted. And so it was like a trial and error, especially early on for me. Now, over the years, again, like I've said, I figured out play styles a little bit. I've learned how to run a more sandboxy game if that's what my group wants. I've learned how to run modules that are definitely railroaded, make it feel like it's open to interpretation more, so it doesn't feel like they're necessarily forced into things. And that's really helped me. The other thing I've found for me when it comes to prep, there's 2 ways to prep. You're either prepping your campaign ahead of time or adventure prep, 2 different things. I'm somebody that I like to do an outline of my campaign prep, and my outline is event-based. So it's something kind of like what Nicholas was saying, I feel, where I will say, at some point, the bad guys are going to try to steal this artifact. At some point, these bad guys are going to unite probably. And all of my bullet points on my campaign can change. Like, players can do things that will change future events. But for the most part, if they do nothing, this is what happens. I've ran campaigns where I don't do an outline. When I don't do an outline, I feel directionless in my campaign. And when I feel directionless in my campaign, I really struggle. Because it's like, well, what is really happening in the world? Is it really changing? For me, I don't feel like anything's really changing in the background then. It's hard for me. Then though, when I plan specific adventures, so when I go in, at the end of a session, the players are either at the end of they've concluded something, or they're still in the middle of something. If they're in the middle of something, I know where they left off. I already know, roughly what's ahead, kind of, because they're in the middle of a dungeon or whatever. If it's concluded, I can then go into it and say, okay, guys, what do you think you want to do now? Like, I'll do this after our session, like right before I go off stream, if it's a streamed game. I'll say, hey, what do you think you guys are going to do now, now that you just killed this bad guy right here? Are you going back to town? Are you going somewhere else? And I let them decide based on the other hooks they've been given over time, or any of that. And it helps me then to prep what they're going towards, if I want to get that specific. However, I like to still prep, not necessarily event-based stuff there, but I'll look at my outline and I'll say, does this make sense for the next step in my outline? Is it, maybe they skip some things, they never see those couple things, and I go to that step. And I actually will highlight with different colors on my outlines. Green means they've experienced it, pink means they've changed it, and then yellow means they never witnessed it. So it still happened, but they never witnessed it. So I use colored highlighters to do it. And usually my outlines for a campaign are upwards of 2 pages. That's for like a long campaign. So that's kind of how I do it. But for me, I feel nowadays, especially since I like improving and going along with my players, I definitely try to leave it more sandboxy. Even, for instance, I'm running Tyranny of Dragons. I, for a while, was letting my players decide what they were doing still, kind of. But I would give them the nudge, and sometimes if I needed to, I really needed them to get there, I would put a timer on it. Like, hey, you guys need to get here, because you know that the cultists are doing this. And if you don't get there in time, well, you're not going to get that item. And give them that information through NPCs or things like that. If they don't go for it, that's fine. But for the most part, they, in some of those modules, that's worked out well for me with that. But I also think, like, again, you can still leave it more open. Like, I'm running Descent into Avernus. I'm not restricting them by any time, by any means. Like, Elturel's already fallen. Like, what are you doing? Where are you trying to go? You know of this, you know of that. What do you want to do? And I know what I really don't want to run in the campaign, so I don't give them those hooks. Like, oh, I didn't tell them about this location. I'm just, that's not important. And I'm letting them, if they want to, skip certain locations because, it doesn't really have any bearing on the overall story anyway. It's just like a cool location with stuff to do there. So, yeah. I guess that was a little bit all encompassing in how I prep more so than Sandbox, but I think you get the point. So with that, Dicely, you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, like, and this came up a couple of times during this topic. We have such a stigma, against railroading, and I mean, like, of course, you don't want to have a whole session be like, I'm just going to tell you guys what you need to do, and that's it. But I feel like it is a tool that has its use, Sometimes your players are stuck. Sometimes the very next plot point is, like, crucial to the story, and you're like, just get here, and then you can branch out again. It's fine. Sometimes you got to use it. What's important is, just not making it your system.
Yes. Yeah, it's pacing. I feel like it kind of goes hand in hand with pacing more than anything. And on top of that, when people refer to Sandbox or Railroad, it's they don't want to be told no, they can't do something when there's no logical reason why they couldn't do it, in that standpoint. Like, if there is a time constraint and they choose to go left, I mean, if you tell them no, you have to go to this point, that's not cool. You know what I mean? If you let them go left and they still somehow get to, like what he was saying with his event-based stuff, like, it still magically happens somehow. It doesn't feel like they're railroaded, even though, where the fork in the road was, both places lead to the same spot, Now, you might later on want to say, oh, yeah, if you would have went the other way, it goes to this place, so that they still now have that illusion of choice. But again, it is really, in a lot of cases, for some people, an illusion of choice. For some people, it's not. They just literally let them go off the rails another direction. Oh, wow. That was weird.
What happened there?
I have no idea.
Somebody has raised their hand.
Yeah, I think I raised my hand and it broke everything. I'm so sorry.
Go ahead,
Lower
Nicholas.
hand. Okay, there we go. Yes, apparently that takes priority over everything else. Which is actually what I was going to bring up. I think what you're saying is basically, like, knowing how to deal with agency in your players, right? Because there's a big difference between railroading somebody and, you have to get to this fight for my story to make sense, but it doesn't necessarily mean that if they don't want to do that, you just make them go anyways, right? Like, I've run into that in a few games where players are just like, okay, you're going to go talk to the king. It's like, yeah, we're not going to talk to the king. And it's like, no, you don't get it. There's a lot of guards. It's like, I will fight every one of these guards. Like, I'm not going to talk to the king. And I think the difference between the DM taking the agency away from the players and the players just disregarding the DM's, like, plan shows a fundamental, like, falling apart of communication. And that's, like, the biggest thing for me with D&D is, like, if what I'm asking you for your players to do is not what you want to do, there's already been a miscommunication there. So I think it's really okay, especially in those situations where you feel like you're being railroaded, and this is kind of advice for people in general, to not just be like, hey, don't railroad us, but really just like, this isn't what I thought we were doing in this game. Like, what is it about this that, like, where did we diverge? what happened, and that can be really good for after game conversations, and just kind of really refocusing things. And I think people are kind of scared to have that conversation sometimes about, this isn't the game that I thought we were going to play. Or you guys are taking a different turn, so I really need to take time and reevaluate my story because it's just not matching up for the playstyle, and that's totally fine. I think those are things that people are kind of scared to happen, and that's why everyone is so much like, "Don't railroad me!" Like, let me tell my story. It's like the story should be a collective thing. It should be something we're doing together. So let's see how we can make that happen, and that's really important for me as a DM.
Yeah, I agree about that. Go ahead, Fred.
So I was just trying to, one of the things I've found interesting is I wonder if the advice that I give on YouTube is actually useful. And it's one of the reasons why, because when you were saying, don't railroad your players, as often as advice that is given on YouTube. And I kind of wonder if maybe as YouTubers we aren't actually that useful because we don't have all the information that each group has. And a number of times I've had people come and ask me advice in Discord over voice and video chat about stuff, and I'm trying to give imperfect advice to a situation I don't fully understand. And I think there's an aspect to adventure design that we often forget, and that is when we're talking about a sandbox, we're talking about you could do anything. You could go in any direction, north, south, east, west. You could do anything. Now, for a dungeon master to do that, that's a hard ask, right? And that's kind of your hex crawl, essentially. Your hex crawl is like that, your old hex crawl. But there's another thing called the point crawl, where you have a couple of potential diverging paths. So you can't go south, but you can go east, west, and north. You might have 3 paths that you can take. And so you get 3 choices as a player to decide where you go. Now, that might be event-based or that might be location-based in terms of traveling distance. But it's still called a point crawl. And within that point crawl, that kind of looks a little bit like railroading. But railroading is usually like there's one line and you just get off at the station each time. But I think Wizards of the Coast does this a lot with their adventure design, is they actually have a straight line path. And you start at A, there's your beginning. And then you get to B and you get off the train. And when you get off the station at the train, there's this little sandbox or town or location or dungeon or whatever it is. And within that location, you can go anywhere and do anything and take multiple routes and so forth. And then when you're finished, you get back on the train and they take you to site C. And they do exactly the same thing. So what you've essentially got is a combination of a railroad and small sandboxes along the way to give your players the opportunity to do their own thing. But within the confines, it's far easier for a dungeon master to manage that kind of situation because there are constraints. They don't have to make everything up. And I think as long as we understand that, it doesn't even have to be an illusion of choice, because I was always thinking about, illusion of choice. But I think the concept is, and what Wizards of the Coast, and I don't like a lot of their adventures, but I understand why they're doing this way, is that it's much easier for a dungeon master to get their head around. You follow a path, you get off the train, you explore, you get back on the train, and you continue on. And sometimes you might have 2 branches, or maybe there's only 1 branch because it has to go somewhere specific, or maybe there's 3 branches. But often when you look at their adventure flow charts for Wizards of the Coast, and I'm sure a lot of other designers and publishers do the same sort of thing, is they don't have too many branches. They don't try to go too many different places, right? They're not trying to do everything. But yeah, I was thinking in terms of you were saying sort of an overview, and one of the things I noticed is with sandbox-like games, where it's very sandboxy, I usually have 1 sentence. I might have more, but often I have at least a minimum of 1 sentence. That's like, what is this all about? Like, what's the threat?
Like the elevator pitch.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, okay, what's going on in this? Well, there's a dark wizard who's currently fighting off multiple factions in the world trying to take over their current location, and so all hell is going to break loose. I don't know what's going to break loose, but that's the basic premise for me as the DM when I'm dealing with a sandbox which has got a lot of scope.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was helpful, but I thought I'd just mention it.
No, I think it was, for sure. I and